of scientific knowledge, cumulatively, within paradigms. And granted the paradigms, there may therefore seem to be the empirical verifiability of certain theories that work, because are suggested by the paradigm. But then, when you get a paradigm shift, a different framework of explanation is involved. And the paradigm shift does not occur because of the weight of empirical evidence. It occurs because within the scientific community there develops, often for non-empirical reasons, dissatisfaction with the existing paradigm. It may lack explanatory power. It may lack coherence. It may prove to be needlessly complicated and we opt for a more simplistic one, and so forth. And so the hold of a pure objective empiricism on science is rejected by Thomas Kuhn. Third example is Michael Polanyi, a Polish philosopher of science who was teaching in Britain. And Michael Polanyi developed his work in two major books, one called The Tacit Dimension, and the other, Personal Knowledge. Now, in both cases, the titles are sort of revealing. The Tacit Dimension makes plain that there are a variety of tacit aspects of human knowledge that are not explicated by empirical research. In everyday perception, we have peripheral vision, which you don't particularly think of until somebody says something about it that draws it to your mind. So that as I look over here, I become aware peripherally that David is still over here. You see? Now, there's always that sort of peripheral awareness, not only visually but mentally, part of the larger context, the gestalt, which we observe, so that the focused objective empirical study is only telling you part of the story. And in his work on personal knowledge, he's talking about the personal dimension in knowledge that affects motivation, choice of a research topic, selectivity, etc. Sometime, if you want to sort of test for yourself the view that science is always purely objective and depersonal, ask a scientist why he is involved in science. I did that once with a chemist friend. And why chemistry? And why the kind of research interest you have in chemistry? And all the while you get either aesthetic judgments or other value judgments in response to the question. That is to say, there is constantly the personal dimension involved. That is why progress in science is unpredictable, because we never know what the personal dimension may be, or for that matter, the socio-economic dimension that drives certain scientific research. So keep in mind Polanyi. And then more recently, we have Feyerabend, who adopts a conventionalist interpretation of science. That is to say, scientific theories are simply conventional ways that scientists have of talking about things. A conventionalism that is entirely relativistic. The science does not tell us about reality. This is anti-realism in science. Now, with those developments, which began in the 40s and went on into the 60s, what you begin to get then is the rejection of the view that all scientific explanation is purely objective empirical explanation in terms of general governing laws, empirical generalizations. That scientific knowledge is always empirically verified, or at least verifiable in principle. That just doesn't seem to be the case. And so the whole thesis of scientism begins to collapse. This is postmodernism in philosophy of science. Now, there's a fourth objection, which you will read about in Stumpf, when he introduces you, you may have read it already, I hope you have, to W.V.O. Quine, the Harvard philosopher, whose famous essay on the two dogmas of empiricism was a landmark in the demise of logical positivism. The two dogmas of empiricism. One of the dogmas is reductionism. Reductionism. The attempt to reduce all knowledge to empirical generalization. The verifiability principle is reductionist in that sense. It's trying to reduce all factual statements to empirically verifiable statements. Reductionism. And he rejects that because of his view that observations are theory-laden and not purely objective and theory-neutral. The second dogma of empiricism is what he calls the analytic-synthetic dichotomy. And plainly, the verifiability principle hinges on the view that some statements are synthetic, other statements are analytic, and they never claim to meet. These are separate categories. A dichotomy. Two different kinds, logically, propositions. And what Quine does is to argue that that dichotomy breaks down. That it's a matter of degree, depending on the context. So that, for instance, if you take, and this is not his example, if you take the statement, God is good, okay, that statement may appear to be, on the surface, a factual statement, which the positivists would like to have empirically accessible. Because it's not, I would rule it out. It's not really a factual statement. But within the context of Judeo-Christian discourse, is it intended to be an empirical statement of a factual sort? Isn't it rather an analytic statement from a theological standpoint? The very meaning of the term God, not only in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in the Platonic tradition, is that God is the good. So to say God is good in that context is an analytic statement. You see? Now, which is it? Well, it can function both ways in different contexts. You see? If you're dealing with a pure empiricist who thinks the word God comes devoid of any such meaning, it may look like a neutral factual statement. But if the word God has any meaning at all in any major religion, it's in terms of God as good. You see? And so what Quine does is to recognized this sort of thing in a whole variety of cases and rejected dichotomy. Rather, he sees human knowledge not as a collection of isolable propositions which we interconnect within a deductive system, Bertrand Russell style. Not that. Knowledge is not the model to be modeled on a deductive system. Knowledge is rather more of a web of belief. Now, the difference is, of course, that a deductive system moves with pretty well military precision from one proposition to another proposition to another proposition all the way down. Logical deduction. Whereas a web of belief would be a web of mutually supportive propositions woven in various ways that are not strictly formulatable in deductive systems. It's a web of hypotheses, interrelated, which we construct. That is to say that the body of knowledge which we have is characterized by coherence. Coherence in the sense that it is unified, it hangs together. Coherence in the sense that it is self-consistent and internally self-supporting. Okay. But it is a fallibilist view, inasmuch as, because of the paradigmatic nature of thought, we may be working with a somewhat mistaken paradigm, so that the overall pattern of interrelationships may be somewhat different from what we think. And in addition to the fallibilism and the coherence, which provides some justification, he offers a pragmatic justification for the web of belief. It works to think this way. And there I think that his basis for the pragmatic justification comes out of the sciences. That is to say, a pattern of scientific hypotheses is adopted and viewed as probably correct because it is fertile, fruitful, in enabling you to propose further hypotheses, to set up research programs, to do research. It opens the way to further things, so there is pragmatic value to such a thing. Well, if then you reject the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, it becomes pretty apparent that the whole positivist scheme is beginning to crumble. Now, the final criticism that I want to note came from Wittgenstein himself. Wittgenstein, who in his earlier work, the Tractatus, had essentially been a Russell-type logical atomist and apparently been a verifiability type of person. Wittgenstein, and in 1945, published his second major work, the Philosophical Investigations. And so when we talk of the later Wittgenstein, this is the work that we're referring to, the Philosophical Investigations. He criticizes the positivism of his previous work in various ways. One is that the picture theory of meaning, as he called it, that is to say the verifiability theory, is devoid of any clear meaning. It sounds like the verifiability theory isn't meaningful. It's the same criticism. He recognizes it. He, however, adds to it the complaint that the insistence on an ideal logical language. You remember we distinguished between ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy. The insistence on an ideal logical language of the sort that Russell had wanted, where you have atomic propositions referring to atomic facts. That is too artificial. Too artificial. It is artificial because the language just doesn't fit into that sort of a narrow reductionist mold. You see, echoing the same criticism as Quine. The language doesn't fit into that narrower mold. In contrast, when you look at ordinary language usage, the way in which language is used by ordinary people, even by scientists when they're not talking scientifically, in scientific jargon, we find that it is much more varied than simply either cognitive or non-cognitive, if cognitive, either factual or formal, much more varied than that. And ordinary language usage, after all, has developed over the centuries of trial and error and sifting. It's tried and proven its worth over the centuries. So what he does is to talk instead of there being a multiplicity of language games, ways of using language. Just as I illustrated now Quine's point with the phrase, with the clause, God is good, which could apparently be taken as either a synthetic statement or an analytic statement. So you might recognize that the statement, God is good, used in a certain pastoral context, that is to say, by a pastor trying to comfort a grieving widow, you see. The statement used in that context is serving another function than simply saying something factual, objective, scientific, or on the other hand, offering a definition or a tautology. The language is intended to perform a function of a, I was going to say a social sort, a pastoral sort, you see. A diversity of language games, because there is a diversity of forms of life. That is to say, games that we play in living, what we do in life. And the kind of analysis we want then is a functional analysis rather than a logical analysis. An analysis not of the logic of language, imposing our narrow positivist grids, but an analysis of the actual functions that language serves in ordinary discourse. You might say it's this Wittgenstein has been converted from a mathematician and scientist to a lover of the humanities. He's been reading some literature while he's been away. But the diversity of language gains. And it is this broadening of the horizon to other ways of using language than simply empirical or analytic, which finally seems to have broken the camel's back there in English philosophy, so that by the mid-50s, I think it's fair to say, ordinary language philosophy was the dominant thing in British universities. Theological positivism had been 15 years before. Now, what had happened in between? Well, these philosophical reactions. But in addition, World War II. And I don't think it's without point that Western civilization couldn't go through the trauma of World War II without discovering how thin, in terms of meaning, the positivist analysis of language really is. And consequently, the broadening expectations. Now, one of the further influences in that shift will come out as you read A.J. Ayer. I have here a couple of pages from his autobiography in which he indicates this further influence. Now, let me read a couple of paragraphs from this. Incidentally, I was fascinated to read his autobiography a few years ago because it turned out that he had been, during World War II, in British counterintelligence. First of all, in German-occupied France, and later involved in breaking the German codes at a early computer-style analytic base in Bermuda. The thing that fascinated me about that was that I was in Bermuda at the same time as a radio technician with the Air Force. And we were sent over from Tinley Field one day to Hamilton Harbour, to an island in Hamilton Harbour to service some equipment. And we're told that we could make our headquarters at a hotel that the military had taken over on the shore and have our meals there, which we did. And curiously, there were a lot of civilians there, whom we figured were simply civilians who had been taken by the military to work on this secret project where we were servicing equipment. For all I know, A.J. Ayer was one of those, because it was at that very time he was there. So was I. So I was fascinated to read his autobiography, because we passed like ships in the night, or like boats on Hamilton Harbour. He says this about how the book was written. I started at once to write the book and completed it in 18 months, working on it almost continuously except for intervals of teaching. I just can't imagine that. I've written all my other books in longhand, but this one I typed clumsily with 2 fingers. That gives me courage. But in the end, producing a serviceable script. Except that the first chapter was adapted from an article in the journal Mind. I made no preliminary draft, but wrote slowly to avoid the need for corrections. I was satisfied, and take heart from this, people, I was satisfied if a day's work yielded me 1 page of 300 words. Okay? And I figured that if in an 8-hour day I could produce 10 pages, I'm doing well. He took 1 page, 300 words. Had I been able to achieve this every day, I should have finished the book in a little more than half a year instead of a year and a half. Since it was only 60,000 words long, some of you were asking yourselves about its length as I came in. So many words for so small a price. Had I been able to achieve this every day, but I was frequently held up, not so much by not knowing what I wanted to say, though sometimes this happened, but by not being able to decide how effectively to say it. I was writing with passion, but also taking great pains to make my meaning clear. Well, this labour was not wasted. What are its demerits? The book did not suffer from obscurity. It could rather be accused of sacrificing depth to clarity. Except in a few details, the thoughts which it expressed were not original. Now, they were a blend of the positivism of the Vienna Circle, which I also ascribed to Wittgenstein, plus the reductive empiricism which I had taken from Hume and Russell. Okay, no surprises there. Plus, get this, the analytic approach of G.E. Moore and his disciples. Now, what do you remember of G.E. Moore? Why, he was a realist, not a phenomenalist. Well, that doesn't influence Ayer, he remains a phenomenalist. But he was interested in conceptual analysis rather than strictly logical analysis. Yes, and you'll be hard-pushed to find in Ayer's book the kind of logical atomism which we found in Russell and Wittgenstein. It's a looser kind of analysis. But add to that Moore, while a conceptual analyst, is still an empiricist who's constantly making distinctions between analytic and synthetic statements as if those two are exhaustive categories. Remember his argument in his refutation of idealism about the statement to be is to be perceived. See? So the influence of Moore is at least humanizing language in the approach. And those with a dash added of pragmatism from C.I. Lewis, American pragmatist of the 30s, 40s. Pragmatism.